Episode 3, and we're actually going to finally talk about why Black Sabbath is so important. And before I do that, I actually want to somehow tie this into the other two pieces that we've done so far. There's a level of control. Like, the crux of what I was trying to get at in the last episode was that I wanted you to be aware that you have the power to select and make decisions in your life that influence your life, right? I may have pointed out some possible design flaws and nefarious natures to how things are dished out financially. And what's interesting is the more people I talk to about that episode, the more I realize that I should do follow-up episodes. A young man decided to suggest to me, he's like, hey, you should probably have like an accountant or somebody that is well educated and would know the nomenclature to the subject matter. He's like, I don't doubt what you're saying, because the more you think about it, the more you realize this is a thing. I said, yeah, and that's pretty much how I approach things. There's a word when you have a tendency to assess ideas or see patterns. And sometimes I give them names, and it's not the appropriate name, but at least fits the description of what I'm trying to explain. And sometimes, and again, this is a thing, sometimes words exist in one discipline that mean the same thing in another, that don't mean the same thing in another discipline. So you will have the concept of elope, right? Is, to run away and get married, right? But when you work in the behavior psychiatric agency structure, elope just means specifically AWOL, run away. That's the thing. It doesn't require marriage usually, but in pop culture, it's tied together with run away and elope. There are tons of terms like this. There is certain terms that only really apply to one discipline, and so on and so forth. This is a concept that, in my opinion, does create a level of control for that specific industry, which I understand, right? You're giving everybody pretty much the same terminology, same opinion and thoughts and language to use. So within their trade, I get the logic behind it. But again, it is a level of control, right? Back in the day, that was probably a larger issue because they would distinguish quickly that a person wasn't in that field if they didn't know the terminology. That's weird because it creates a weird bias because it's almost like a Tower of Babel, like designed, like the fact you have different languages explaining the same exact thing. So somebody may have working knowledge about something, but they don't know the language, but yet they're still considered outliers. I have a tendency to do that a lot, like, because for me, a lot of this stuff is like reverse engineering. Like, I'm looking at it, and as I'm looking at it, I'm trying to break it down to get a better understanding of it, to figure out how to navigate around it, integrate into it, so on and so forth. Context clues, just watching patterns, asking questions, pointed questions at a specific point in time. This is just how you engage the world, right? And I just noticed that what I pointed out is a thing. And I'm going to tell you this right now. All of this stuff is heavily opinion based on my engagement in life, right? Some of it is fact. I should probably work better to distinguish that to help you, the listener. Some of it is genuine opinion, and opinion worked with the same model over and over and over again, right? So the way I look at things is I present information based on how I engage them and how they're presented to me over years, right? So it's almost like if you go into a job and somebody's teaching you the ropes, that's how I'm presenting this whole program. Now, I'm going to heavily focus on the arts and every so often deviate to social things, just average social things, like the last episode. I decided to put that first because I want you to be aware that you control how things are as a collective and as an individual. Your money comes to you. You decide how you're going to spend it. There's certain things you can't avoid in life. Obviously, clothing, food, shelter. And I pointed out that it's weird because it's almost like the system is designed for you to automatically have to pay for that. And through that, you disseminate and spread the capital structure, right? You're spreading the money even if you don't want to, right? You can't be so ultra conservative that you're not spending any money because that's not how it's designed. It's automatically designed to be in debt to a certain degree. But the disposable income you have, you decide what you want. So if you want to be like drink heavily, you got to spend lots of money on alcohol. If you really love music, it's a show through what you're spending your money on, right? Sabbath changed everything. They created a whole different subgenre, and they became consistent, which is extremely important when it comes to the arts. I mean, for the most part, in the mid-'60s, late 60s, there was a whole summer of love concept, but underlying, there was a lot of stuff going on. You had a lot of Vietnam, a lot of protests going sour, a lot of overreaching. Corporations at the time started to move overseas and undermine basically the American worker. So this weird creeping darkness set in, and I'm going to kind of define it as such. The unsettling balance that diminishes the overbearing lens of light and color that presents the world in an irreproachable way. Artists have tried to communicate this darkness. Some of them have successfully done it. But what's weird is it's not focused on. Like, what bothers me the most is that everybody wants to put everything in this two category structure, right? This is absolute evil, absolute good. And sometimes the absolute good does horrible shit, right? Because there's a switch, there's a quick pendulum to the other side. I don't view the world that way at all. It's people in the world do horrifying shit. And I'm going to indirectly paraphrase Charlie Murphy, right? Because he said in this one of his, he didn't want a spoken word, but I definitely liked it. He's like, there's over 7 billion people in the world, right? So at this point in time, at this very second, somebody's doing the most horrifying shit you can imagine a human being doing. At the same point, the best thing about human beings is being done at that same time. And I'm completely paraphrasing what he said, but that's definitely Charlie Murphy said that, right? And that's true. There's a truism to that, right? But in between, there's several different degrees of gray. And by putting everything in this weird dichotomy, you have a tendency not to want to work through the gray. It's just much easier to shuffle things off. And I think that's why you get the weird, happy, strange fucking veneer of happiness, right? And it erodes. Probably more so than darkness. Darkness, you have to figure out how to compensate and move against. It's very present. The happiness with erosion underneath isn't as clear. Even though they're trying to be, I guess, lack of color concepts, the absolute white, there's still, in my opinion, a lot more gray than white, right? Honestly, in my experiences in life, the only time I actually experienced things that were just definitely happy is when people were doing, and they felt they were doing for the right reasons. And they constantly checked themselves to make sure they were, right? I've also been around people that didn't want to they created this weird, like, everything's great, everything's awesome, right? And this is how you maintain this, and we have to maintain this. Like, this is like some edict, like some weird, like, punishing rule. Like, if you don't maintain this, bad things are gonna. No, you're just gonna be real. And the phrasing "keeping it real" is kind of like one of those things. Like, the goal is for authenticity, not fucking veneer life, right? And when creeping darkness settles in, right? Like, example, this is actually probably one of the life examples. I have no problem talking about death. Doesn't faze me at all. It's one of those things that I've been unfortunate enough to have dealt with it and help people go through with it. And it's just a thing, right? I don't accept it as a finality, right? This is not something that's like, oh, well, that's just standard, right? I don't write it off. Death is a hard thing, right? And it can be death ranging from a concept or a movement or people, right? Everyday people, your mom, dad, sister, brother, grandfather, friend. It doesn't sit well when it's definitely people when they're younger, way before their time. And in your mind, you're like, this is horrifying, right? But that subject matter, bringing that up and wanting to talk about that and talking about life and like what one does in those situations disrupts that veneer, right? You're bringing in a topic that will honestly turn people off really fucking quick. Even more so when I was younger. Now it's kind of like, I'm not sure if it's because of the rise of atheists in our culture or just the way we talk about and process things. It's gotten a little better. Like, you can actually talk about funeral rites and all that stuff. And that's the thing. And in my opinion, that's a real reality. That's something that's going to happen that you can't avoid, right? You can be prepared for it as best as possible, like when it comes to like policies and procedures and all that, but you're not going to be prepared for it emotionally, right? And I don't mind talking about that either. Right? I mean, I've had, again, really close people to me die, right? And but the idea, the notion itself is a form of creeping darkness. It shows up and lingers, right? And in my opinion, that darkness needs to be processed. You don't bury it, right? You talk about it, right? You can hire a therapist to talk about it, or you can talk about it if you have really solid friends. That, what I just said, is probably a subject I should address at some point in time. Friendships. Because I think the lack of having those type of relationships in our culture now, in the 2024, is a big issue. It doesn't seem to me that those relationships exist anymore as much. But my ass is also old, so you take into consideration that. So I'm going to address the dichotomy. One piece of artwork that I definitely like. Pause. The idea of good versus evil as the ultimate, it's a clear one fence, one side, one side. Now, even the yin yang I'm skeptical with. The concept that there's darkness and light and lightness and dark, right? That to me seems archaic. It's an old way of thinking, right? So before I move on to the main example I'm going to give you, right? Because my kid's watching it right now, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, there's a lot of shit in this show, right? Comic books. In my opinion, comic books and reading comics, which, we still look at, most of the pop culture looks at reading comics as there's something wrong with you if you read them, right? Because of some propaganda from back in the 50s. The better writing was realizing that not everything is ultimate evil and ultimate good. It's not just always the good versus, the good villain, no, good hero versus the villain, the evil, absolute evil villain. It's not. It's the layer of gray, right? And understanding the better villains, the villains you understand. That's a thing, right? So, there's a show that was on HBO back in early 2Ks called Deadwood, right? Now, with most of the historic shows, you take them with a grain of salt because not everything happens the way it happens. You have to create a narrative, you have to create drama and all that stuff. Some of it did, some of it didn't, right? So I don't necessarily exist in a generation that says, your kids cannot watch this. They're too young. They're bad concepts. No, this show literally shows you the degrees of evil, right? What you perceive to be evil, right? So as you're working through the show, you get from Swearingen, I think that's the guy's name, all the way to the absolute evil perceived by the last episode, which I think it was Hearst, right? And this is a thing. This show literally bathes itself in degrees of gray to flush out the villains and the heroes and the anti-heroes, which is the one in between. That's very important. That's why the anti-hero back in the day was so popular. Like the Clint Eastwood, he's not just the only one, but he was the one that became really famous because of it, because he played the anti-hero really well, right? But that was a thing because it shows that there's something else in between. And what's weird is allegiances move. Like even with samurai films, you have that structure. I think it's interesting to itself. But Deadwood is a really good example of that. And I praise Deadwood for going to 3 seasons. I really wanted a few more movies, but the end movie was pretty good. So there's 3 seasons of Deadwood. And it's HBO, HBO proper, not this nonsense you have now. And there's a film that eventually was made afterwards that kind of ties up everything after the fact. But even with the opening sequence, which defines, like, pause a second. Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is Sergio Leone's famous film. It's out of all of his work, that's one that's probably known the most, right? And how they set up the character beats at the very beginning of what you know about the characters, the little married to concept, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Is at the very beginning they give you these vignettes, like these pieces of how they're introduced to you. And you interpret them. And you realize that the good guy kind of jocks this really weird line, right? It's not as good as you think it is, right? And Deadwood does such a great fashion in how it sets up his Bullock at the very beginning. So my son is watching this, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, a lot of people would be really upset. Oh, I can't believe you exposed my kid to the. No, this is how, at a fundamental root, how hard life works, right? Because as the show goes on, they marry to the place. They become, a state and so on and so forth. They get out of the territory piece, and they're building society. Ultimately, what the show does, it navigates through gray. And for a child or adolescent, especially an adolescent, you kind of want to understand how that works. I mean, what's weird about literature, films, the arts, is it shows you, gives you the feel, right? Without the experience. So indirectly, you're gaining some level of wisdom. And I genuinely think Deadwood itself navigates through the murkiness of life. Granted, I already told you, I said, I think there's portions of it that are just design narrative, right? Not based on fact. It allowed him to go through the murkiness of gray. Because life kind of gives you that. And I think what bothers me the most when I said about the veneer and the idea that everything has to be happy and pretty, and it bothers me that that's the only way we engage things. I'm not sure if just to create the illusion that we're doing well. I don't know. But shows like Deadwood and art in general, thus going to the Black Sabbath concept, is important. It makes you feel, it makes you think, it provokes ideas, it helps you gain over time a collected wisdom. In other words, how to gauge life and how to understand and interpret life. Having everything just on the up and up and in this very clean, almost like mechanical fashion doesn't work. And I think that's why, especially in the mid to late 60s, the anti-hero gained so much clout and so quickly. And that's why you have like this happy, weird, quasi-hippie psychedelic music and the sonic push that you hear, right? From the outside, right? And I think that is striking, that touching into the pulse is where Sabbath came in. I know I went a long way around that, but bear with me. The unsettling balance that diminishes the overbearing lens of light and color that presents the world as irreproachable. Creeping darkness is kind of presented in a lot of earlier songs, and they touch on this. And sometimes they touch with the dichotomy of evil versus good, and then blend it, showing you the gray in between, right? Even as far back as Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues, 1936, right? Jack Turner sung Nightmare. What's weird about some of these songs is that, we're now passing Halloween when I'm recording this, is some of them end up in Halloween compilations because some of them have weight, right? Actually, probably one of the most famous songs about that creeping darkness, that the fact that now I'm stuck in this and my lens and my perception of the world needs to be altered. Now, people in that situation, don't get it fucked up. I don't think they should remain in that situation. I think being exposed to that darkness way too long does fuck you up, right? I've worked probably about 112 hours in a work week. There's 168 hours in a week, right? But you do what you need to do sometimes, right? And I needed to do that. And I did it for quite some time on and off, 96 to 112 hours a week. And that does affect the way you perceive the world, right? Because you're seeing the happiness of the things that you cannot engage in at all. You see the fun or the interesting things you would like to do that you can't necessarily do, right? And over a prolonged period of time, that does affect you, right? Actually, anything over a prolonged period of time affects you, but that definitely does, right? So, actually, probably the best example of the creeping darkness would be also in the movie Barbie. It just came out last summer, and death. The idea of death enters her head, and she shares that. But that's a thing, right? But they didn't want to. No, let's not talk about that, right? So one of the most popular songs that addresses this and has a person that I cannot see the way things are anymore is the Rolling Stones' Painted Black, and that's 1966. But I would argue that in 55 or 56, Chuck Berry, again, I'll reiterate as king of rock and roll, had a great song on his album, debut album, the Downbound Train, right? And to me, that right there kind of fits into the mold of openly saying this is a thing, right? This creeping darkness, right? Actually, Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues, right? Standing at the crossroad, baby, rising sun going down. I believe my soul now, poor Bob, is sinking down, right? That's a phrasing from the song, right? I'm not going to do that justice, so bear with me. The engine with blood was sweaty and damp, and then brilliantly lit with a brimstone lamp. And the imps for fuel shoveling bones while the furnace rang with 1,000 groans. That is Chuck Berry's Downbound Train. That's 1956, right? these ideas are just there. They already existed in lyrics. Like this was a thing. People did address this, right? And by addressing it, it was like there was enough, like, I don't know. My arguments about the church and evangelical structure is a thing, but I'm not going to get into that. But the idea of having, like, not talking about that is weird. Like, anything that's being processed needs to be processed, right? Anything that's presented, like, what is that about, right? And you need to formulate a working opinion. And what I mean, the key word, key phrasing is working opinion, right? I have a lot of them, right? And you should. And you should always be challenging your own opinions, right? Even if you get facts, always do that. Present the facts. And also analyze the facts, because not all the time are facts. Sometimes it's interesting articulation of language that is presented as fact because they're somewhat based in facts, but don't make it so. Because you go further back, you realize this is a little gray. Not necessarily light gray, but, charcoal gray. One of the actual Beatles songs, and in my arguments about the Beatles, I think they present really well in a song called Help. Rubber Soul is the turning album for the Beatles. Like when you talk to people that are really enthusiastic about the Beatles. But I think Help really kind of like defined that movement, right? Because it was becoming aware of like somberness, like sadness. From that point on, their music kind of reflects a different direction. It's not simply "I want to hold your hand" or "twist and shout" anymore, right? And that song was released in '65. I do believe it was a soundtrack piece. And then you have "Painted Black" by the Rolling Stones. No more will my green sea go to a deeper blue. I could not foresee this thing happening to you. The famous line, I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore. I want it. Two children black? Is that what the lyric is? The idea of like, this is now my lens. This is now how I perceive the world. Right? And it's during that era of like people coming back from Vietnam and so on and so forth. And this was also people coming back from World War I and shell shock and the history to that, which is, let's not talk about that. Shh. They used to write it off and curb it. It's like kind of suppress it. No, this is an issue. Let's talk about this, right? But putting it into two different categories and just simplifying the process and not processing it is a weird thing, right? So it allows the creeping darkness showing up in pop culture and art is a very important thing because it's there to provoke you. It's there to provoke conversation and engagement, right? Or for you to identify with. Let's say you perceive the world in that light, right? And you feel all alone, which is probably even worse, right? Thus my argument about pop music, right? Ideas like this keep going through as far with like bands like The Doors. Actually, we're probably going to touch on The Doors at some point. I'm probably to get more into them. I think really musically and structurally, The Doors kind of set up Alice Cooper in an interesting way. Like if you listen to The Doors, some of the music kind of translates really well. Alice is a little harder when it comes to the music and go more into the horror theatrics. Morrison and Manzarek seem to just ride that line. I always thought that was interesting. Revisiting The Doors is more or less the concept of like thinking about the songs like The End, which didn't get a lot of radio play. But when you go to the albums, you kind of have a tendency to appreciate them. There's many albums like that. So typically, like you have music directors and people like selecting tracks and so on and so forth. Unless you bought the albums, you didn't know sometimes the song existed, right? Like Did you know Downbound Train existed? Great song. I'm telling you, it's a brilliantly clever song, right? But you know Maybelline exists, right? Because you've heard it in thousands of movies, right? So that's the thing. The end became part of the larger culture, but it was more or less after a certain point. Actually, I want to say even in Apocalypse Now, it doesn't have that whole breakdown piece. It's minus that, even though it's on the soundtrack, right? So the precedents. So enough about Creeping Death. The precedents prior to that for sound, for the sonic, bombastic, aggressive sound, was in various different arrangements, right? But it wasn't. Again, this was sparsely done. This wasn't a thing consistently presented, right? So you have uh, garage rock, and underground rock. So you have like bands like the Novus. Now, I probably will get into underground concepts later on, right? But you are aware there's enough art in music and movies and all this stuff that exists and have existed for several decades that is not mainstream, right? And I know Generation Z and some millennials are not fully aware of this stuff because when you have conversations with them, they realize they don't know this is a thing, right? That's why I exist to talk about this stuff, right? But it is. So it even exists further back. Like rock was an underground thing at one point in time, right? So one of the early examples I can think of the sonic aggression for especially for its time was the Novus Crusher, right? That guy's literally just being even though he's imitating a wrestler, he's still just the gnarly vocals in that song are brilliant, right? They, eventually, years later, the Cramps do a really good cover of it. But honestly, the first one is really good. So the Cramps met the original in their cover song. So that's why it's still celebrated till today. Cream in 67, Disraeli Gears. That had a major influence by Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix at the time was in England. So the ability to push the guitar sound and distortion and whatnot was there. It shows up on that album. Hendrix does this like willy-nilly. His skill set to just get what sound and what style he can out of a guitar. Like I have a mastery of playing guitar, so now I'm going to bend that to whatever will and whatever sounds I can utter from this and put it into a composition, right? And his existence in England, because obviously we didn't accept him in America, all race issue and whatnot. I mean, the best thing about it is he got a good backup band, but he did influence things heavily from that point on, right? He went to England, and we still going through the British invasion to the changeover from the British invasion, like because there is a difference between the early British invasion when they cleaned them up and combed them up, gave them suits, versus the mid to late 60s, right? When the stuff got really interesting. Because America was not sitting passively by. They would definitely, again, we produced The Doors and a lot of other bands. So they literally matched that ability. And this kept going, okay? The Stooges existed in the 60s. The Stooges, Iggy Pop is the godfather of punk rock. But to a certain degree, the Stooges weren't they existed, but they were in the margins to a certain degree. It's fucking sad, right? So we have to export our really cool shit to other countries in order for it to come back to us and go, oh, yeah, this is cool. That seemed to be the structure, right? So Hendrix changed everything, in my opinion. His presence in the 3 albums and even the Band of Gypsies changed everything. But Hendrix didn't offer the thing Black Sabbath offered. Another example of this would be Blue Cheer Summertime Blues. Their cover of Eddie Cochran's, they do a cover of Summertime Blues. And this thing is awesome. Like, it's just straight heavy. Like, The Who did a cover at the time, and The Who's is pretty good. But in contrast, because they released around the same time, like maybe be within a year and a half of each other. But Blue Cheer's cover is that precedence, that sonic sound channeled, that chaos channeled really well into a standard early rock song. It kind of defines rock, the first wave of rock being splintered. This is definitely going to be the second wave, right? And usually you see that with waves. They'll pay homage and nods to older structure, right? Same thing with ska, same thing with punk rock, so on and so forth, right? A song that was actually somebody brought up in one of the things I covered was that was Born to Be Wild, because heavy metal thunder is actually said in that song. However, I honestly say The Pusher by Steppenwolf, which is off the Easy Rider soundtrack and their respected album, definitely captures that droning component to it, right? Iron Butterfly and the God of the Vita is a heavy song. And I want to say they may have one other heavy song on that album. But again, not consistent enough to definitely be defined as a genre. You have all the components there. You have the creeping darkness within the lyrics, the perception of reality, the things challenged, right? But you don't necessarily have it all together under one umbrella. Now, arguably, you could probably say, well, the Doors were definitely flirting with that idea. However, the way I look at the Doors is not the same way traditional people. The Doors to me sound like a jazz band that decided to play rock and did a great job doing it. Because their switch ups and the way they construct music, their compositions are fucking brilliant. And to a certain degree, you had Morrison as a writer, and he didn't necessarily. Again, there's a whole thing to the Doors, especially the album Waiting for the Sun. Because if you ever open the album, there's tons of lyrics in that album that don't appear on the album. You actually have to search out that Celebration of the Lizard as a separate track. And I think maybe in the last 10, 20 years, they finally released the studio version of that. Because prior to that, you had to get it on a live album. But I think they would definitely... The Doors definitely brought in the components you need for goth music. And yeah, it's really weird. If you listen to what they're presenting, there's definitely a lot of that there. So they definitely kind of embrace the darkness. So what happens is you have the Stooges that exist. But nothing comes together until 1970. Now this is like 69, 70, 71. And I will actually say to you, from listening to a lot of albums, 69 to 74 is definitely an interesting 5-year piece. I don't know what the fuck happens from 74 on, but definitely from 69 to 74, there is definitely I wouldn't say a Wild West structure in music, but there's definitely a lot being pushed and different styles and different thoughts and just a lot of interesting shit. Now, here's what's weird. I'm not sure what was played on the radio at the time because I didn't exist. But when you listen to the albums, you realize there's a lot of interesting shit here, right? So Black Sabbath's album comes out in 1970, and this thing charts, right? Sabbath takes the creeping death and the sonic blasts of the psychedelic structure and put them under one umbrella and give you the first full-fledged heavy metal group. What's weird is they didn't see themselves. I remember seeing an interview with Ozzy Osbourne. They just thought they were the same as Led Zeppelin, right? Now, Zeppelin's interesting. I'm not going to get into Zeppelin too much, but they are, there's both two bands that spawned out of the Yardbirds, right? And actually, you could probably say three. Cream, but Cream's style is not the same as Jeff Beck group and Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin and Jeff Beck group are very similar. It's almost like the Jeff Beck group was like the proto version of Led Zeppelin. Even though that wasn't the same, but obviously the interests and proclivities are there because they come from the same baseline, same group. Big, Yardbirds were a big group. But Ozzy Osbourne just interpreted what they were doing as the same thing as what Led Zeppelin was doing. And Led Zeppelin was not doing the apples and oranges, but he could not perceive it as being such from what I got from his comment, right? And I thought that was interesting. I'm like, really? I mean, you have Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Bill Ward, and Geezer Butler, right? And this alchemy amongst these artists, because that's what they are, right? They're interpreting things and presenting, processing them, and releasing them, right? You can give them a scale from 1 to 10, how great they are, and put an academic approach towards it. But realistically, they're artists. Ozzy Osbourne's voice is very, very fucking distinct, right? And I appreciate it because it sounds the way it does, right? This band's alchemy is very clear and becomes a precedent to a certain degree, right? They are the first heavy metal group, and it took them a while to identify that. And what they do as the first metal group, which ends up inspiring generations, is because they got so popular so quickly and sold as much albums, everything, they make them a top 10 in 1970. In 1970, during the middle of a fucking flower power fucking weird, because it's not necessarily yippie, but it's definitely hippie culture. Like everything's great, the forest nature and all this. And these people are talking about some dark shit, right? Or challenging the people that want to put us into the war machine, right? Paranoid, right? The idea of just being depressed and being afflicted, that creeping darkness. That is the standard in their music. From that point on, this band changes pop culture, right? And the ripple, it's interesting because this period of time, there is a switch off. Because you have Alice Cooper, and I would even say Alice Cooper is heavy metal. Not to say there's no heaviness to Alice. There is. But like I said, I find it interesting because it kind of transfers what the Doors were doing to a certain degree. And he elevates the art. Especially the group, which is from the very beginning up until I think Teenage Lament was Muscle Love. That's the name of the album. Alice Cooper, the band, kind of just like presented it at a higher, more theatrical level, right? The two ideas intersecting are not crazy, but Alice Cooper and Led Zeppelin existing in that category made sense. That's definitely hard rock, or what becomes defined as modern rock, because they're not doing the same thing as rock was doing in the 60s, but they're definitely, you can see the baton changeover, right? Hendrix, Cream kind of set that foundation for this to exist. Led Zeppelin definitely set the precedence of what rock will be in most of the 70s. But Alice Cooper did too, right? Thus explaining why you get AC/DC later on and so on and so forth, right? Sabbath is constant in their aggression and their droning and dreariness. Not only talking about the idea of like, Satan hunting you down, but also the idea of like, let's challenge authority. Let's challenge these things that are being pushed upon us. Because they're working class kids coming from England. Right? And the English bands. So their metric system and how to get onto pop charts were different. Now, when they cross over to this country, how they're treated is a little different. I mean, if you roll out what Black Sabbath's influence was, is eventually them and many other bands led to that whole farcical satanic panic, which I'm not going to get into today. Initially, I actually had a lot of notes on that, but I'm not going to even bother that. Right? And that leads to the Satanic Panic leads to witch trials in the 80s. And most of you are like, what is the witch trials in the 80s? So in the 1980s, there are like 4, 5 distinct trials to put music on in the public sphere to judge, have a court judge against these musicians. To my understanding, Ozzy Osbourne, when he'd already had a solo career, was initially targeted. Dead Kennedys became a result. So basically, it was Dee Snider and John Denver fighting off the PMRC. You have Dead Kennedys trials, right? You have Two Live Crew. You have Judas Priest. So maybe it was just 4. There were several trials to attempt to do this, right? And this was a thing. But the Satanic Panic kind of set up that scenario, right? Satanic Panic, just to sum up quickly, was that everything was somehow in liege with these large cults, right? I think my opinion was that, and this was found years later, that people have a tendency to put patterns together, even though sometimes they don't belong together. And when push came to shove and they were really digging through, they realized this is not as big, this is not connected, this is not as broad and as rampant as one might think this is. So this was the thing, right? Consistency with the introduction of heavy metal was important. And unlike most artists prior to that, they would hit that note, Sonic Blast, Creeping Darkness, but they wouldn't maintain it. That wouldn't be their whole catalog, right? Sabbath does this for 6 albums straight. Really, really, really well, right? Not only establishing a genre, a subgenre of rock and roll, but also like cementing the foundation for it, right? Now, I'm going to sidebar here. Consistency is very important in your life and in establishing things, okay? Because it is fundamentally a building block of life. In order for things to work a certain way, you have to be consistent, right? Even including your body. Like you don't shit enough, you might have colon problems there, pal. Right? Yeah, I just brought that into the conversation. Because I can. That's what I do. Ta-da! So, but the idea of like being able to go to work, get the same paycheck, feed yourself a specific diet, read specific books, that consistency helps you build things. Sabbath releasing 6 consistently strong albums. Guaranteed metal is going to stay for quite some time. Right? And oddly enough, the subject matter inspired, helped fuel what later became punk rock. And Darkwave. Right? The goth connection. Right? Those all exist because of Sabbath. Probably more so. There's a lot of attributes to them if you read a lot of these music books. The building blocks in society allows for artists to keep going. So why I presented Vote Your Dollar as a second episode rather than the third episode, which is originally the design, is that if you want these artists to keep going, you have to give them consistent feedback and money and attendance, right? You are the vehicle that helps them. I know it sounds cheesy when these bands say, oh, well, our fans are great. Their careers, all artists' careers, shit, all politicians' careers are based off their individual customers. I will actually won't even say fans, customers. Right? It's no different from Corner Store. this allows the individual artist to thrive, right? At this point, I'm gonna have a note talk about corporate aspects of things, but I'm not going to talk about that because that's like a subject for probably a later episode. So, metal gives you the consistent droning sonic aggression that is required. So, when you think about the cheesiest, happiest song, right, as an earworm, throw on Black Sabbath. Because what happens is it helps you like combat that weird, like this song's talking about fucking nothing, right? And then you can throw in War Pigs, and there's a precedence for this because War Pigs exists as a song, right? And it's funny because that song exists, and I'm telling you, striking when the iron's hot is very important. They did so because years earlier, Bob Dylan had this song called Masters of War. And actually, a few people have said I give out homework. If you really wanted to check out the compare and contrast between these two songs, I would do so because they're talking about the military industrial complex, right? It's sharp criticism of it, right? And Dylan's song Masters of War exists on a previous album. Like it's one of the first, actually, again, first 10 Dylan albums, extremely important. I'm going to be focusing on Bob Dylan in a few episodes from now. But they kind of emulate. But the difference between Masters of War and War Pigs is War Pigs has just the hook and the song itself commands attention. Not saying Dylan's doesn't, but Dylan's did not get played as much on the radio, especially at the time it came out. Black Sabbath not only created a whole subgenre, but that song was able to linger in pop culture sphere. It still plays on the radio till today, right? There's a handful of Black Sabbath. Like one of the few Black Sabbath songs you won't hear on the radio typically is like "Children of the Grave." Like that's not a standard, song you would hear. But it's a known song. War Pigs still gets played on the radio till today. So presenting truth, commentary, and the darkness that was needed in order to counterbalance any veneer in our culture. And what's weird about this creeping darkness is all it really is requiring you to do is to talk about it, right? How many times have you been around people that just don't want to talk about that shit? Those people scare me because when shit goes sideways, they're not mentally prepared for that possibility, right? Look at our culture right now. We kind of need to be. So sometimes the subject matter, even though people try to avoid it, at this point in time, it was even worse, right? You can, honestly, I want to say Gen X definitely pushed that envelope a lot harder. As an Xer myself, I addressed the bullshit that my parents pushed upon me. And I would address the bullshit that was pushed upon my friends. Because it's fucking bullshit. Right? And no matter how, wow, you're really negative. No, man, I'm just trying to be real because this is bullshit. And you have to recognize it as such. And you have to break it down. Right? Negative could be pushed into that creeping darkness. That idea of oh, wait a second, there's going to be nuclear war, or there's going to be a breakout, or there's going to be... The potential's there. Right? I like to use the word probability. Right? Meaning that it doesn't mean it's so, but there is a chance. With establishing Black Sabbath and why they become so important is not only are they just obviously foundation for heavy metal and other bands, other subgenres to follow, and the alchemy they had as brilliant musicians. I think that's what everybody wanted me, go through their catalog and talk about their songs. I'm not going to do that. This is not what this is about. Their existence allows that in our culture. They came up and existed. No matter how dysfunctional they became later on, their existence allows precedence for us to build upon. They became the building block for other great art. And that's why they're fucking important. And you have to understand that.